Welcome to another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum where all voices matter. Well, the disruption in world supply chains and markets continues, and none greater than in energy. Here to discuss the impact of the Russian invasion and other factors on Canadian oil and gas is Dr. Tammy Nemeth. She is the host of the Nemeth Report podcast, and welcome back to the program.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
I guess the first thing is I'd love to get your assessment for our audience of where things stand, and are we in for a long-term disruption on world oil and gas markets?
I think there's a massive restructuring going on, not just in the world oil markets, but in how we operate our financial institutions and the financial transactions that go along with oil and gas and energy. For example, since Russia's been made a bit of a pariah, and there's all these calls to boycott them and whatnot, they've turned to other venues to sell their oil and gas. In particular, there was a massive announcement in February at the Olympics of a $177 billion deal with China to divert oil and gas resources to their markets. And in so doing, they forewent the use of the US dollar, which is significant. If the US dollar was considered the petrodollar and helped smooth the operation of financial markets, they're now not using it anymore for transactions with respect to Russian oil and gas. Saudi Arabia is now also considering using maybe the euro or the yuan in their deals. And this has profound implications for not just the energy markets, but for global markets in general.
So yes, this seems to be a trend. I know Putin has for years railed against the US dollar as the reserve currency, and China has been busy trying to create an alternative to that. So you see this as another step along that way?
Absolutely. And when Joe Biden the other day made his comments about the liberal order, kind of falling apart, and now there's going to be a new world order, well, this coincides with what the IMF and the World Bank has been saying for the past few years, that we need a new Bretton Woods. And Bretton Woods was the financial structure that took place at the end of World War II that set up the IMF and the World Bank and utilized the American dollar as the global currency. So there's been discussions and conversations going on about a new Bretton Woods. It's unclear exactly what that's going to mean, but it seems that Eurasia is already embarking upon their own way, and how the United States and the rest of the free world, as they call themselves, will fit into this is unclear.
Now, hitherto, Russia accounted for 10% of oil and gas production in the world. And so their exit from, as you called them, a pariah state, if Russia is indeed a pariah state, if countries start to exit or do not renew their contracts for Russian oil and gas, is that going to have a profound effect on world markets too?
Well, I don't know. I think the markets will just be displaced. So right now, there's been deals between Russia and Iran, Russia and Iraq, Russia and Turkey, Russia and China, the one I mentioned earlier. But they're also negotiating with India and offering them a price discount if India would take their oil and gas. So the oil and gas will still be there on the market. It just won't be purchased by Western countries. So I'm not exactly sure how that will pan out in the longer term, but I don't think that the Russian oil and gas will be completely removed from the market. It's just going to go to other sources and not Europe. And that's significant for European policy.
Yes, it is, and definitely want to talk a little bit about that as they exit their Russian contracts. They've got, I guess, two ways to go. They can ramp up oil and gas purchases elsewhere, or they can, I guess, ramp up their transition to non-carbon energy sources. What do you see happening?
So what I see is a sort of repeat of the 1970s. I'm a historian by training, and I've researched a lot about the 1970s and 80s energy crises and how the world got out of them. And what I see, which is a little bit problematic, is that you have the IEA and their 10-point oil reduction plan and the EU's Repower EU policies, both of which dust off the 1970s policies that didn't work, that weren't so good. So they're talking about banning cars on Sundays from driving into cities, to introduce staggered cars entering cities based on their license plate number, reducing speed limits.
I'll hold that thought. It's an important one. We'll be right back after these messages. Welcome back. Tammy, I had to cut you off there. Please continue your thought.
Well, the EU Repower EU strategy talks about how they want to have a windfall profits tax. They want to increase production of renewable energy and have oil and gas price control. So these things were brought in the 1970s for the most part, and they were unsuccessful. What really made the difference in breaking the back of the energy crises was increasing supply. And that was one of the fundamental principles of the foundation of the International Energy Agency. So it's rather bewildering that they won't even mention that. They mention a little bit about supply in their 10-point plan, but for the most part, they say, well, we're going to be getting off oil and gas anyway, so there's no point trying to increase supply at this time, which makes no sense at all. If you increase your supply, then you lower the prices, and it helps affect due demand. So what that means for Canada is that we also are embracing these sort of crazy policies about doubling down on renewable energy rather than increasing the production of our own supplies. Stephen Guilbeault, Prime Minister Trudeau, Jonathan Wilkinson have all been going around Europe and making comments whenever they can that there's no point increasing production because it'll never get to the market in time. But it's about sending the signals. And yes, it might take a few years to bring it in online, but you can still do it and still send that signal to the market.
Yeah, and that's the other thing too. Obviously, for some observers, the obvious thing to talk about is Canadian oil and gas production. We're a democratic state with rights for humans who are in our country, as opposed to some of the other oil-rich states out there. But we're not getting that signal from the federal government at all, are we?
No, not at all. And in fact, they're doubling down on their net zero plan and the discouragement of investment in oil and gas production in Canada. So they're still sending the signals to the banks to not fund it. They're happy to back up activists when they make their comments about not supporting Canadian oil and gas divestment at universities and so on. So it makes no sense and is bewildering why they're supporting the Joe Biden going around to Venezuela asking for more production, and going around to Saudi Arabia and various other OPEC countries begging them to increase production, when Biden won't support increasing American production and Canada's not supporting Canadian production. All they're offering Europe is that we'll help you develop hydrogen or we'll help you do more renewables, which makes no sense when we're sitting on the world's third largest reserves of oil. And part of the problem is lack of infrastructure.
And there is, you mentioned the U.S., so we should turn there for a second. And my comment is, when you look at voices in the U.S. Congress, the Senate, the House of Representatives, there are voices saying, let's rely on Canada. It's better than relying on Venezuela or Saudi. But again, the Biden administration is not taking that bait, are they?
No, not at all. And it's the same type of people who are backing the Biden administration are supporting the Canadian government. So it's that progressive mentality that we need to keep fossil fuels in the ground. We have to stop using coal, oil, gas, all of those things that are reliable, and instead put us on the pathway of unreliable renewable energy.
Let's talk about the Canadian consumer for a second. April 1st, another carbon tax hike. Your thoughts on that?
Now that Canadians are being pinched at the pump with these high gas prices, the only province that has made any move to try and help the consumer is Alberta, where they're planning to reduce their tax on fuel. But I mean, as far as the Trudeau government's concerned, the more people pay, the quicker they can get to the renewable net zero utopia. And that's been one of the fundamental principles behind net zero, is to make it expensive, make it hurt, so that people get off driving their cars and embrace the renewable transition. It makes no sense for a modern economy to try and run itself on renewables. Europe should be a shining example of the problems that occur. I mean, the energy crisis was in Europe before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. There was high prices and lack of supply for electricity, and that was caused by these terrible policies that we're embracing now. And all it does is make consumers suffer and increase energy poverty.
And indeed, when I look at the UK as an example, obviously out of the EU now, but they're planning a tax reduction, a fuel duty reduction for their suffering consumers, and are looking at new North Sea oil contracts and even fracking. So a big difference from what's happening in Canada. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Dr. Tammy Nemeth. She is the host, as well as being an historian, she's the host of the Nemeth Report podcast. Tammy, we've been talking a little bit about net zero. I'd like to drill down a little bit on that, pardon the pun, but obviously, as you mentioned, it is still a goal of the Trudeau government, full steam ahead. In your opinion, should this be the priority right now, or do we have other things that are as crises that are more relevant right now?
That's a very good question. I believe there's other priorities the government ought to be focusing on, but this is the centerpiece of the Trudeau government in the negotiation with the NDP and their new power sharing agreement, or however they wish to describe it. Climate change was one of the biggest things. It had 5 or 6 points on it, and all about doubling down on the net zero transition. So there are other priorities. We need to get our economy going. And I think one of the problems with the Liberal government is they don't seem to understand that energy is at the heart of everything. It is an expense that goes into everything. So if you increase the cost of energy, then everything else increases as well. And by encouraging banks to not fund oil and gas companies, to not fund exploration and development and increase supply, then that makes everything more expensive, which then has an effect on inflation. So by restricting supply, we actually are creating this inflation problem and making it difficult for our economy to grow. So the net zero policies are designed in some way to not only discourage people from utilizing a fair amount of energy, but it also makes everything more expensive.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, because it also has impacts on food prices, as an example. We know that food prices are likely to go up because of, again, Russia is the #1 grain exporter in the world, and Ukraine is the #5 exporter of wheat in the world. And without them, with that supply chain disrupted, there's going to be an automatic impact, especially for perhaps lesser developed countries, but certainly for the world price. And then when you add on that greater costs of transportation due to net zero policies, then you're talking, you say energy is the most important. I would say food and energy are the most important. So is that your point of view as well?
Absolutely. I believe that energy security and food security are inextricably linked. And we're ignoring that at our peril, because it's not just that like production will decrease because these things are off the market or it gets more expensive, is that energy and petroleum products in particular create fertilizers. And so if you make the cost of energy more expensive, then it makes fertilizers more expensive. And I know that there's some fertilizer companies in Europe that have stopped production because they can't afford the energy cost. Mm-hmm. So if you don't have access to the fertilizers in order to have the appropriate yields in agriculture, then that restricts the food supply, makes everything more expensive, and has a possibility of not just energy poverty, but food poverty. So these are several different things that are interconnected and linked, that our governments seem to just pretend they're separate, and they really need to be taking these things into account.
What's your assessment? Why do you think that in Canada this really hasn't been a matter of large debate or discussion thus far?
That's another good question. I mean, if you look at the way our legacy media operates, there seems to be tight control on what types of conversations are permitted. Now, the Financial Post, the National Post do have contrary sort of articles in there. But if you were to watch regular news programming or whatever, these types of issues are never raised. When do they talk about Canadian energy security and the strength of hydrocarbons? That it's rare if it comes up at all. So I'm really grateful that the News Forum is here to provide alternate viewpoints to maybe raise awareness to the public that these are issues that are extremely important, that the citizens need to understand and pressure their elected representatives to not go down this route. We are looking at extremely high energy prices, food prices that could break the backs of working Canadians. We need politicians and representatives who will stand up for us. And part of that is making sure that we have a strong energy security plan that takes into account the essential role on a cost-benefit analysis of hydrocarbons. When have they ever done a cost-benefit analysis of renewable energy? There was a scholar out of the UK who has done so and has said that it's a disaster.
We're going to take another brief break. We'll be back with Dr. Tammy Nemeth after that break. Please stay with us. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Dr. Tammy Nemeth. She is an historian as well as the host of the Nemeth Report podcast. Tammy, earlier in our program, you mentioned the province of Alberta and their efforts to shield consumers from the ravages of spikes in oil and gas prices, giving them a little bit of a tax break on that. Are there other things that you're looking at Alberta to do, given the inactivity of the Trudeau government on some of these issues?
Well, I would hope that the Alberta government is pressuring the federal government using whatever tools in their toolbox that they can to increase the approval of pipelines and infrastructure and to help increase the production of net zero hydrocarbons. There's a lot of technologies out there. There's a lot of carbon tech that can make the production of oil and gas as close to net zero as possible. Yet that's being discouraged by the federal government, where it says that if Stephen Guilbeault and Jonathan Wilkinson had a joint article where they said, we're happy to support carbon tech as long as it doesn't actually increase oil and gas production. Well, a lot of the carbon storage that companies can do would be put into oil fields that would then help increase more production. The thing is, if you can take as much carbon emissions out and put it back into the ground and it increases production, but is still net zero, why can't you do it? Why would you discourage that? Why would you remove any of those tax breaks that other companies get to use from the hydrocarbon companies? So I hope that Jason Kenney and the Alberta government are pressuring the government on that, and to ensure that all these new ESG regulations for hydrocarbon companies will be done in a manner that won't discriminate against Alberta's resource industries. And that right now, I think, is, besides the energy security issues, is a real big problem. And I hope that they're addressing that.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously a lot of technology that has improved over the years, and that it's not just simply the case anymore that if you're involved in hydrocarbon extraction, that it's automatically going to impact on your net zero calculations, or at least to a meaningful extent. So, but that technology is not being held by Ottawa at all.
Well, I think there's a little bit going into different things, as long as it's complicated, right? Because sometimes it seems like the federal government doesn't want to support the industry, but still wants the carbon tech, because they still want to be able to use some of the petrochemicals that are crucial for things in medicine and various other economic activity. So there still needs to be an industry there. So I think they're trying to support carbon technology that will help keep those parts of the industry going. But they still, I think the net zero plan and the recent net zero advisory board document says that they really want people to just stop using oil and gas. That's their big recommendation. And I think part of the problem with our federal government today, and with now the new NDP coalition, even though it's not a coalition, is that a lot of the activists who support these extreme measures are now in positions on advisory boards. They occupy positions in the bureaucracy. And so I think it'll be very difficult for the federal government to move away from these types of extreme policies, because now these activists are embedded in government and giving the advice to take these extreme courses of action.
Yeah, and that's, you're saying that's within ministers' staffs and offices, or even within the bureaucracy?
Even within the bureaucracy. Like, there's been quite a few that have been hired into the Environment Climate Change Department, a few that have been hired into natural resources. There's former activists from the Pembina Institute and various other environmental groups who now hold positions in the bureaucracy. So there will be quite a lot of resistance to pursue the types of policies Canada needs for a strong energy security when there's people in the bureaucracy who won't want it.
Well, I don't know where all this started, but certainly you've detected a trend there, and it's one that does not provide the best advice to government. That's certainly for sure. And certainly when Canada goes to international fora, they're not necessarily at this point advancing which can only be described as clean tech solutions, unfortunately. So Dr. Tammy Nemeth, thanks for being on the program once again with your insights. It's great to have you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
Another interesting discussion with Dr. Tammy Nemeth, and certainly Canada can do more and should do more to provide better solutions for the world when it comes to energy. We'll be following this again. Thanks for watching.